retirando a uno de nuestros panelistas y otro de nuestros panelistas no va a poder estar con nosotros porque se enfermó. Pero bueno, esto nos va a ayudar a tener un poquito más de tiempo para entrar en conversación los unos con los otros. Entonces vamos a tratar de pensar, digamos, como si fuera un embudo, ¿no? Ir como de lo general a lo más particular y empezar a pensar en las conexiones que hacemos, ¿no? Cuáles son los temas que han venido emergiendo y también pensar este panel como una parte esencial de la conversación que hemos tenido a lo largo de este coloquio. Voy a hacer una introducción.
Other than to say it's just a delight and a pleasure to be here, and I've had the privilege of working with a number of you in various different iterations and configurations over the course of the years, some of them primarily virtual, but fortunately some of them in person, and it's a preferred mode of interaction. But in light of what's we're all facing, this juggernaut, we have to find any ways to connect that we can, and so look forward to being in communication and in conversation with you. And so, seeing how the other panelists hasn't arrived, we will start with Marielena Hincapié. So let me just provide a reader bio here. So Marielena Hincapié is a distinguished immigration visiting scholar at Cornell Law School and the former executive director of National Immigration Law Center and the Immigrant Justice Fund, where she spent over 2 decades shaping some of the most pivotal legal and policy fights on behalf of low-income immigrants. She was recently named by Northeastern Law's Judith Oland's Brown Forum for Women in Law as the practitioner in residence for 2005 through 2006. She serves as chair of the board of directors of the Management Center and the board of trustees of the David and Lucille Packard Foundation. Additionally, she has held fellowships at respected institutions and continues to influence national dialogue in immigration, equity, and democracy. Marielena earned her Juris Doctor degree from Northeastern University School of Law and is a sought-after speaker and media figure. Marielena is from Medellin, Colombia, and grew up in the Central Falls, Rhode Island. She is writing a narrative nonfiction book, Becoming American, A Personal History of a Nation's Immigration Wars. Marielena serves as co-chair of the advisory committee for the Global Anti-Eugenics Center. And so we're going to start out with some comments, and then we will hear from our respondent, Alina, and I'll introduce her when that happens.
Wonderful. Buenas tardes. Can you hear me in the back? Yes, wonderful. So grateful. Milton, thank you so much for chairing this panel right now. And one of the things that I will say, and I mentioned this at the beginning of the inauguration of the colloquium, is I am not an expert in eugenics like most of you are. My exposure to eugenics really started only about in 2017, 2018 is when I started thinking about it mostly, and that was during the first Trump administration in the United States. At that time, I was leading the National Immigration Law Center, and we were suing every month, sometimes multiple times a month. We were filing different lawsuits, and we were winning. We were winning in front of Republican judges, Democratic judges, but what became very clear to me is that we were not winning in the court of public opinion, and that the amount of legal and policy rights and human rights that were being lost in the United States and also globally, we're going to take so many decades for us to undo the harm that I wanted to take a step back from the day-to-day of lawyering and being a movement advocate and activist, and instead to really think long-term about how do we change the narrative. But in order to change the narrative, I needed to understand how did we get to the narrative that Trump announced on his first day of presidential campaign back in 2015. And what I learned through that process was it was rooted in eugenics. And that is what started my journey on learning about eugenics and understanding how it continues to play today. And so, because this panel is very much about the media and the narrative that the eugenics narratives that have been constructed around migration and I would say anti-Blackness, anti-indigeneity as well. I'm not going to provide too many media examples because We live it every single day in the world. We hear it on the radio, we see it in newspapers, etc. We hear it in bus ride conversations or at a cafe. We hear it perhaps even with people in our own families, in our communities. And so instead, what I'm trying to do today is really provide a framework of my reflections on what I have been learning and how I see the moment that we are in. And as Milton said, I think one of the, unfortunately, Chelis Lopez, the journalist, is not able to join us, but it gives us a little bit more time to have a discussion already through each of the panels. And I'm thinking particularly the previous panel that you were on, Milton, and others, just so many threads and narratives and frames that are interconnected. And so hopefully we can have a longer conversation, a richer conversation, where all of you can participate and share your thoughts as well. So with that, I'm gonna start by saying, you know, again, everyone in this room understands that eugenics did not end with the discrediting of science, and it persisted, and it has persisted throughout the decades through institutions, policies, and narratives that have continued to sort and define the worthiness of human beings long after the term of eugenics was considered taboo for some time. And much of our work has rightly focused on how eugenics continues to permeate the fields of reproductive justice, disability, public health, and so many other fields that we've been talking about for the last few days here. What I want to do today is to widen that lens and to include migration as part of our discussions, and particularly the way that migration is narrated and mediated, that I believe has become one of the most socially acceptable and globally portable spaces where eugenic logics continues to operate every single day in our life. And although it may not do so through explicit claims about biology, that is not how our politicians speak about anti-immigrant sentiments, but through stories and stories about who belongs, who is considered a threat, who is considered a burden to society, and who is a threat to the future of nation states. Today, some of the most popular, powerful population sorting narratives really are about, they're no longer happening in laboratories or in academic journals. They're taking places on the headlines of newspapers, in political speeches, in media images, right, in internet memes, and especially about how people are talking about migrants and refugees. My argument today is very simple, I think it's also in parts unsettling. My argument is that one of the most normalized afterlives of eugenic thinking is the global construction of anti-migrant narratives, and that the media is how those ideas travel and adapt and endure. So to begin with, you know, I say I don't believe, and we all do not believe, that eugenics ended. It simply migrated, is the way I think about it. Eugenics did not disappear after World War II. We've been talking a lot about that over the last days, but it changed form. And one of the places that it learned to survive most effectively is how we socialize and talk about migration. And today, population control rarely speaks in the language of biology. It speaks in the language of borders, legality, security, and crisis, as we hear so much about border crises all the time. And so again, I want to suggest that these anti-migrant narratives are one of the most normalized ways that eugenics is playing out. But let's take a step back, right? Before there were even borders to defend, there was land to be taken, or at least some people saw the world that way. And the harmful theory of manifest destiny meant that colonization of the Americas required population management long before it used the scientific name of eugenics. And there were three interlocking strategies that were used for colonization of the Americas. One was indigenous removal, enslavement of Africans, and then the selective Northwestern European inclusion. Everyone else was excluded, right? Everyone else was considered inferior. And the place that eugenics most shaped immigration policies in the United States, and I would say then also globally, was in the 1924 Immigration Act, right? And leading up to the Immigration Act, this notion of who was considered inferior included Eastern Europeans, Southern Europeans, right? People that today would consider themselves white. And earlier in the previous panel, there was a question from someone in the audience about the construction of race. And in migration, it's one of the places we see that time and time again, of how that construction of race changes over time. One group that was considered unworthy and inferior is excluded, and then over time that group has assimilated and then becomes included, but then they also exclude another group of people. And we've seen that time and time again throughout our history in the United States, but some of the places where this began in immigration policy that was the most harmful was starting with public charge. So the public charge rule, which was from 1882, really started with trying to exclude people with disabilities, people with illnesses, people who might become a burden on the state, on government because of their illness or possible future illness. And that has stayed with us, and it's one of the most prominent parts of the first Trump administration, and now the second Trump administration is taking that to yet another extreme. We saw the exclusion of Chinese workers, Chinese community, and then the all-out ban on Asian migration as well. And then in 1924, then it was the specific exclusion of Eastern and Southern Europeans with the national origin and racial quotas. Interestingly, that migration, all those exclusions that were taking place that were inspired by eugenics, did not include an exclusion of Western Hemisphere migrants, and the reason for that was because of their labor. For labor demands, economic demands, they still needed some people to come in. And so again, we see time and time again throughout history, not just in the United States, but throughout the world, where certain people's bodies are needed for labor, but they're then disposable, and then sometimes they are not wanted when their labor is no longer needed. And again, we see that not just with migrants and refugees, but obviously we've seen that through slavery, and also the way that slavery continues to play out today. So there is, I think of these migration policies as not to be a continuity, not to be in competition with Indigenous and Black histories throughout our world as well. And then to look at how borders have really become part of colonial technology, the way that I think about that is, again, that 1924 eugenics-led immigration policies was also the same year that the Border Patrol in the United States was created. And again, you can think of, and this is the way the policymakers talk about border enforcement as necessary to manage migration, but it's actually also to stabilize the outcomes of conquest, right? Once overt colonization became illegitimate, or at least not acceptable, then borders were inherited the work that colonization actually had been doing. It's a continuation of that same. And so we see that playing out today. In Europe, for example, European leaders debate processing asylum seekers outside of the EU, when what they're really debating is how far away can we keep other people suffering so that it's politically tolerable. In the Americas, we see that migration is managed not as a human reality, right? Just a global human, and I would say that migration is a global phenomenon of all beings, right? Birds migrate, dolphins migrate, whales migrate, etc. Butterflies, right? The beautiful monarch butterflies that are migrating right now here in Mexico. But that across the Americas, we see migration being managed as how to contain disruption, right? Not recognizing the why people are leaving, like the major drives of climate change being one of those drivers. And then the way that this is all taking place is through media, right? Media is the delivery system. That's the technology that is being used. And, media itself, the technology and the platforms didn't create fear or organize it, but it's used as a strategic platform by fear mongers, politicians in particular, to create the cultural and the political conditions for their policy agenda. And the eugenicists of the early 1900s really understood this. As I've studied them, and one person in particular, Madison Grant, who's the author of the the passing of the Great Race, I see the media genius that they had even 100 years ago, right? And so, he writes this book that is really telling the policymakers and people in the United States, Northwestern Europeans, I should say, descendants of Northwestern Europeans, that their race, right, that they are about to commit racial suicide. The white race will no longer exist if they continue allowing more migrants to come. And then he gets together a set of colleagues to write editorials and talk about his book. And then other colleagues write books, and they're all talking about each other and creating this ecosystem, really about that being the buzz, right? That is like the latest books that are being talked about, the latest worldview. But they don't stop there, right? They then reach the masses by writing shorter articles in very common magazines that are in doctor's offices, in waiting rooms everywhere, that are sold in grocery stores like Cosmopolitan, right? Good Housekeeping magazines, Reader's Digest, places that are more accessible to people, right? That's one of the ways that they're distributing. They're getting on radio programs. They're speaking at public rallies that unions are holding. They're writing op-eds in major newspapers. They're also sitting down to meet with editorial boards. So you see this very sophisticated media strategy, because they understood they needed to create this narrative strategy to create the cultural and political conditions to ultimately get the policy changes that they wanted in 1924. And again, they were successful in doing so. And for the United States, what that meant is that between 1924 and 1965, almost 4 decades, migration was severely restricted in a way that we have not seen again until the current administration in the United States. And so in today's world of mass media, you don't have any more media, from my perspective, no more media savvy person than Trump, right? He's the one who kicked off, again, his campaign coming down that escalator. And here's the 2 places I'm going to quote some language. So in 2015, when he came down, you all probably remember this well, he said, quote, "When Mexico sends its people, they're not sending their best. They're sending you the people they're sending you people that have lots of problems, and they're bringing those problems with us. They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists, and some, I assume, are good people, but we're going to focus on bad hombres," right? So that was Trump in 2015. And, the way he talks, like, it sounds like some people are like, oh, he's not really real, etc. He's not racist. He's just saying these things. And we see, right, that you can call it whatever terminology you want to use it, but at the end of the day, what's very clear to me is this is eugenics talk, right? That is what this is. This is at the roots, someone who is very clearly has a worldview of some people who are worthy, who are not worthy, who belong, who do not belong. And the language that they have been using consistently throughout the first Trump administration and the second Trump administration is literally word for word. In the academic circles, it would be plagiarism, right? It's just, in terms of how they're using the language from then. And then just this week in Davos, right? He is talking about the states that have had pro-immigrant policies, and particularly focusing on the places like California, New York, Minnesota right now, which is under attack, and talking about how those states are protecting, quote, they're protecting criminals, and those are the ones that we have to get out of the country. The murderers, drug dealers, the mentally insane. They emptied their mental institutions into the United States. End quote. And then he continues to talk about Somalians in particular, Somali refugees who have come to the United States, who are lawfully present in the United States. And he says about them, he says, these are Somalian bandits. Can you believe Somalians, they turned out to have a higher IQ than we thought. And we say they are people with low IQ. And you know what? They're pirates. They're good pirates. But we will shoot them out of the water, just like we shoot the drug boats out, end quote. I get chills, right? I mean, this is about very boldly, explicitly, unapologetically say, we will kill people that we believe are inferior. You can get no more eugenics than that, right? And so, the way that the narratives around migration have been framed over these last years, and again, every single day we see it more and more, is migrants as invaders, right? Migrants as, and this is true again in Europe, we're seeing citizen patrols, right? People who are defending their communities, who are taking it in their own hands to block people who are legally seeking asylum under international humanitarian law. Different context, but same story. Migration is also being reframed as war. What you're seeing in the United States with, again, the administration and this is a moment where not only are labels being reframed, but also we are at the border of nation states being reframed and border lines being redone, like Venezuela, for example. And this language of invasion is also a population panic signal, right? It sends a message to people, you should be afraid of these people that are having more babies than you are. And then turning around to white people in particular and saying, you need to be having more babies, right? And so there's this population control and population panic that is part of that invasion frame. And then I think the other thing that we're seeing, which again comes from the eugenics world from over 100 years ago, is political leaders referring to people as garbage, right? And when you refer to people as garbage or filth, then removal of those people is about sanitation. It is not about violence. At least this is what the framing that they're trying to put forth. And in the this language appears all over in US campaign rhetoric, in far-right media in the EU, in Latin America commentary about undesirable flows, right? Who is coming, who is not. And once people are framed as garbage or waste, then disposable, right? Making those people disposable, not even referring to them anymore as people, but as garbage and objectifying them, then their erasure, whether it's through physically killing them or through policy, that is what becomes law. And then, I will close by saying that the language of immigrants committing crime is as old as the colonization has begun, and regardless, it doesn't matter how many academic journals, statistics, research that shows that immigrants are not committing crime at any higher level, and in fact, often at much lesser than individuals born in those particular countries are. But the replacement theory and the panic that has been created as a way to shift the focus of your average person that is truly struggling, right? They may be struggling for economic reasons. They don't have access to healthcare. They don't have enough money to feed their children. And instead of focusing on the capitalist system that is not serving the people, instead, by blaming migrants and refugees, you shift the blame and help put the spotlight on another set of people, and then you're pitting groups of people against each other, and that they tap into and exploit the anxiety that people have. And then lastly, I'll just say, is again why this matters for us here is across the world, these anti-immigrant narratives are not a deviation from eugenics. It's most socially acceptable continuation of eugenics. And if eugenics was once at its core a project of deciding whose lives were worthy of cultivating, whose bodies were worth supporting, and whose presence was threatened the future, then our task here has never been only to reject science, but to ensure that we're dismantling the systems, legal, cultural, narrative systems that continue to define and categorize this worthiness of our humanity. And what I've tried to suggest today is that immigration has become one of those systems, right? A space where population control consists and persists through the language of crisis, security, legality, and where media gives those judgments a sense of inevitability and common sense. And across the world, we're seeing these same stories. And so the future that we are building, and the earlier panel was talking about imagination. And I see this moment as one in we absolutely need moral imagination to imagine a world, a future that we're building that includes that who may move, who may belong, who may reproduce, who may thrive, will tell us whether eugenics is truly behind us or simply more sophisticated. And an anti-eugenics future, therefore, requires that we confront not only biology and history, but requires that we pay attention to how we narrate, how we tell the stories of human mobility, including that we're looking at not a human-centric view of migration and not only migration across national borders, but also migration within communities, right? Migration within countries from rural areas to urban areas as climate change, war, poverty, and other drivers of migration continue, more and more people among us will experience migration. We will be forced to migrate. We will see and be living with near people and being in community with more people that are migrants. They may not be transnational migrants, but they will be migrants and experiencing many of these same narratives of invasion, criminality, et cetera. And so I'm very excited to have a conversation with all of you today and with Alina as well about how do we imagine that future really that is inclusive of all of us, that is grounded in our shared humanity. Gracias.
So thank you, Marielena. But before I introduce Alina, I just want to check and see if Adele has had a chance to show up.
Okay.
Okay. So let me introduce Alina. So Alina Peña Iguarán is a research professor at ITESO, the Jesuit University of Guadalajara, and a member of Mexico's National System of Researchers. She's level 1. She holds a PhD from Boston University, where she specialized in war, memory, and subjectivity in narratives of the Mexican Revolution. She conducted her postdoctoral research at El Colef in Tijuana on art and the border in a project entitled Poetics of Excess. Her current work explores the tensions at the intersections of aesthetic practices, politics, and social action in contexts marked by violence, disappearance, and migration. She is a member of the Hemispheric Encounters Network, the International Studies of the Gays Network, and in Tempore Working Group. So welcome, Alina.
Hola, ¿qué tal? Sí, ¿se me escucha bien?
Sí.
¿Sí? Va.
Nosotros.
Bueno, pues nada, quiero agradecer muchísimo la invitación. Y la
The
verdad,
invitation, and also I would really like to thank Marielena's presentation, and I think she of course has a very, very important work on the streets, and I think that her reflections also resonate along with me. So trying to comment and link this roundtable with the previous one. In the previous one, we were talking very interestedly about authoritarian, imperialist rationale and how that we are thinking how that can be translated by generating perspective to that imperialistic logic. So I wanted to focus a little bit more on what are some of the narratives that this rationale or this logic is circulating, precisely what has been happening these last few weeks in Minnesota. It seems that there is really no type of shame from the government to see all of these horrific images. That is, these images where the police officers are shooting in the face to women. And so it seems that there is really no embarrassment. That's how probably we would see it in Mexico. There is really no concern for that violence to be seen. All the contrary, it seems to be a whole scenography, a whole spectacle of this official violence that is almost being taken to cinema level. So that is one of the things that I would like to say, that brutalization of this device, that is to say that we cannot just limited to the geopolitical borders between one country versus the other. This is disseminated, and it is really generating some of the scenarios within the country. So this is legitimized by making this a spectacle by its own ways of action. That is to say, that they're using this visibility that is incredibly spectacular. And on the other hand, I can see that these narratives, just as Marielena was mentioning, appeal to a mythical nostalgia. And we were seeing actually the other day, a friend of mine was sharing a video. She lives in Arizona. This is a video from the national the Department of National Security Department, and these were some images that seemed to be from this movie. What was it called? This movie? I forgot the name. The Sound of Music. Well, I remembered it in music, in English. So we have this beautiful green areas. And so this video that is circulating in Instagram shows those green lands of United States that is almost a myth that they're trying to go back to, that they're trying to bring back. And so I think that it's very interesting how, and this is not just Trump, by the way, but how people tend to keep going to this past that we need to go back to or recover. And of course, that is a past that is white, homogeneous, that produce a harmony that we know that have very violent consequences. Now, something else that I can find in these narratives has to do with the repertoire of the 20th century. Of course, we have seen some of these images from Eyes, and I don't know if maybe you saw this show, Ender, but pretty much is all of this fascist aesthetics. And so that's why I'm saying that it seems that there's almost like a spectacle or a scenography of these raids, specifically when we're talking about the United States. That is what is shown, and they don't really care. They don't mind. All the contrary, it's almost like a glorification of all of this. And the last thing that actually would have to do with these narratives that Marielena was mentioning as well, she is talking about how they refer to migrants as trash, or those people that are included as migrants in that category, then there is filth and a dehumanization. And so that is the otherness. And that is a damage that is justified by this security discourse. So I think that maybe one of the things that really scare me the most of what is happening now has to do with something that Marielena was mentioning as well by the end of her presentation. She was saying, very concerned, it doesn't matter how much knowledge the academia can generate or the specialized knowledge spaces, and for them to prove the lack of coherency of these eugenics policies or narratives, because one way or another, it's like they are not really going anywhere. And so I think that is one of the core aspects of the crisis of the truth. That is to say, specialized knowledge doesn't really have a way to be able to fracture the common sense of imperial reason. There is no way to be able to fracture the perspective of imperial reason or logic, because due to the media, due to the saturation of the entire technological and digital ecosystem that we are a part of, we cannot fracture that, because also the information is so quick that there is no time for reflection or for thought. This has to do with what has been called post-truth, but we can think about this as saying, okay, what else actually is building up this truth right now in this era, and it has to do with these processes of the condition of what is socio-digital, technical, acceleration, and this is something that we are actually working a lot here at ITESO. So how this becomes or has an impact on subjectivity processes, or as Rosana was mentioning, how it sort of gets rid of the subject. So it's like an emptying, and the violence is part of that emptying as well. And so this process of the crisis of truth has to do with something else that Marielena was mentioning as well. How can we create counter narratives that can fracture or make it evident of how this common sense has been produced? So we have been working with Rosana and also over here in our team a lot of a notion of the aesthetics practice in the face of the media, which has to do how we can tell stories from a different perspective. That is, how can we hack, so to speak, those tales and those narratives that, well, they have been very dominant for a very long time and very homogenic as well. And these has to do not just with that discourse that can recognize other bodies, other perspectives, and other visions, but it also has to do with methodologies that can be collaborative and collective, that can be produced in those aesthetic practices that can actually interfere in certain spaces. But we know that for now, these are interferences that are very small. These are just gestures, because I do think that the avalanche that comes from this imperial reasoning has a brutal force. And I have actually read that brutalism text from Mbaye, and there is a brutalization of necropolitics, of necromachinery. And I do think that we're starting being part of a very dark era. So it's going to be fundamental to try to generate not only these dialogues, but also try to generate some other practices that will then allow, and also, it was being said in the previous roundtable, a different possible imagination. It's very hard to think about a different possible imagination when our desire is so captured by fear. Because if something enables and activates all of these narratives is a huge fear. I mean, we're talking about horror that paralyzes, or that also makes people crazy, which is another dimension of this, right? There is a speech that makes people crazy to the degree when, for example, when we're talking about Trump, you never know when it's true, when he doesn't, when it's not. So it's like we are all the time under constant alteration as a state. So it seems that what we need to appeal to are slow process, but the situation is so urgent that hardly you can actually afford the luxury of having these slower spaces. So that as well, I think, is very impressive. And with this, I will close my participation by now, but it has to do with this crisis of the truth. And it is coming to a territory that is very fertile, because we also need to recognize that institutions have really not been doing a great job. And that is something that has been capitalized in the worst possible way. So I think the challenge is huge, because what is happening is that we see some of these processes of authoritarian populism of all colors and of all winds. So I probably would leave it there as a first comment to the presentation of Marielena, and I really deeply appreciate once again the contribution. Very interesting. Muchas gracias, Alina. No pude ver cuál es el nombre.
Yes, thank you. Hi, I am Cristina Gomes. I am a demographer, not eugenicist, and a physician first, and then a PhD in population. And I am from Brazil, living in Mexico for 33 years. So I'm working about racism and eugenics now. I'm very proud to be here with you, because in Mexico you don't excuse eugenics in general. So it's a very important start point to promote the discussion in a colonized country, multi-ethnical, with no. So okay, nothing. Okay. I'm Cristina Gomes, physician, PhD. Okay. I'm working in racism eugenics. I have some people invited to participate, just because I think we have to promote eugenics, the discussion, studies on eugenics in Mexico, even from the primary, the first grade of the school, because people should understand the history of racism. Why we think until now for 5 centuries we have the same. So racism is not a prejudice from an individual, but it's structural, and the origin is in eugenics. We have to discuss it with children to change this reality in the future. I have prepared some images. I don't know if our colleagues could put, as the discussion is about images, maybe I can answer some questions you had. Because this is a presentation I made in Brazil Embassy. That's why it's in Portuguese. We have flows of African migrants, South African migrants, first in Europe, then to the United States, and now to Latin America. 3 steps, no? When the borders are closed, they have a lot of controls, first in Europe, in the Mediterranean Sea, and then the United States in the border with Mexico in the north, and now also in Guatemala border with Mexico, in all the borders in South America, because this is the flow. These are the flows from Africa to Europe. No, the next one, please. This is the image we have. The next one. No, the previous, the Mediterranean, the ship. This is the image we have in the media in general. A lot of Africans invading the garden of Europe. No, they are exasperated, hungry, and invading Europe. However, the number of migrants from Africa increased 30% from 2010 and 22, but 80% of them migrates to the African countries close to there, not to Europe. From the other 20%, only 4.5% of them, only in the total migration in the world, only 4.5% are Africans. They are a minority in the migration flows. Okay, and moreover, 90% of the migrants who arrive in Europe, they arrive legally with a passport. They are invited. There are agreements between Europe and Africa to contract the better, the high technology people who study, and the best ones from Africa to go to Europe. They are not, the majority are not in the ships, like we see in the media. 80% of them are there by plane with a passport, legally migrating to Europe. And they contributed to the development of Europe and of their countries, because they send remittances to their countries in Africa. So they are contributing for both continents. That's the truth. Those are the numbers, and not the images that the press wants to believe and hate. Okay. The next one, they are working in good conditions. For example, the University of Lisbon is in Africa, attracting students, the best students, to go to work in Portugal. And all the European countries do the same. The next one is the other migration. As Europe closed the border, it's more difficult to cross to Europe. So they are coming to cross to the United States. However, they cannot enter in the United States because the border is closed also. So they went to South America. They go to South America. Can you see the next one? The first one, they arrive in Brazil by plane. Africans are going to Brazil first because Brazil has the higher number of embassies in Africa, and they don't need a visa to enter in Brazil because there are agreements between Brazil and Africa. Brazil is the second country in the world in number of African descendants. Okay? So there are a lot of agreements, and they arrive in Brazil because it's easier. From Brazil, they cross, as you can see, by bus to Lima, Peru, then to Ecuador, then to Colombia, then to Venezuela, in all this route, they are supported by local guides who they have to pay for that, okay? In Brazil, there is a Bolivian waiting for them in the airport. They pay $1,200 to this guide to arrive in Colombia, to all the buses, and also walking until arrive in Colombia. In Colombia, you can see in Colombia, they have to cross to Panama, but it is the forest. There is the forest, the Darien forest, that's the worst crossing border in the world. So they have to cross this border and cross all Central America, also by bus, paying guides, etc., exposed to the organized crimes. They are raped, they are kidnapped, etc., 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 until they arrive in Guatemala. And in Guatemala again, they have to cross a river, and they need to cross this, to pay to cross the river, and also the danger of criminal organized crime. And then in Mexico, they try to cross all the country to arrive in the border. This is the reality, no? So this, you can see they crossing to Peru, and then crossing the forest. Crossing the forest, the last one is the border with the United States, and the previous is crossing the river from Guatemala to Mexico, no? So it's a tragedy, no? And here, some of them come to Mexico City because they can't cross to the United States. They come to Mexico City. You didn't show the photos, please. Yeah, they are crossing to Peru, then to Panama, Darien, and then the river between Guatemala and Mexico, and then the border with the United States, okay? So they can take 1 month, more or less, to cross everything, if they don't have any problem. And then they arrive in Mexico City, the next, because they cannot cross. Some try to work in Mexico City, and they were living in these camps in the downtown, in Condesa, in the middle class neighborhoods. Obviously, there were conflicts, and the government made arrangements to send them to some housings in the south of the city, because it's more agricultural. They can work there. The problem is that these people who migrate are not the poorest. They are the most educated, and they are lost in these routes looking for a better salary to send to their families, to pay the debts they take with their families to support the trip. So it's a complete tragedy. So the Mexican government changed the policies first because the United States forced threatened with more taxes to Mexican products to enter to the United States if Mexico don't control the border. So Mexico had to control the border between Guatemala and Mexico, but then they made arrangements to provide some documents to these migrants because they need to stay in Mexico waiting for an opportunity in the future when they could cross to the United States. So this was the humanitarian visas, provisory visas, definitive visas, refugee visas, a lot of visas according to each situation to protect them in Mexico. Because if not, they have to come back all the trip, and they arrive here with a lot of debts. And some suffered a lot of violence in the crossing of all the borders, and some were robbed. They don't have 1 cent when they arrive in Mexico, so they need to work and to be protected. That's the policy that the government is developing now in Mexico. Maybe I had answered some questions. In general, this is the situation. half of the population only in Mexico are covered by Social Security, so they don't have Social Security as the half of our population. But there are NGOs and also the government have some programs, special programs to protect them as they protect the informal workers also in Mexico, no? And they have support from the United Nations. And there is now a strategy, a national strategy to control the illegal traffic of migrants, because that's the problem of violence, with a gender perspective, with prevention, protection, and regulation of the status, the legal status, and the persecution and investigation of the crimes against them, and collecting and integrating information about migration. Now we have data about these informal migrants in Mexico.
Thank you. We actually have a fair amount of time. Marielena, I'm wondering if you'd like to maybe have a quick moment of response, and then maybe we can open it up to questions.
Sure. So maybe un comentario más que todo, Alina, sobre lo que estabas comentando sobre la verdad.
About what you were mentioning. Oh, sorry. Yes, so my comment actually was going to be mostly, Alina, about the presentation that you provided, where your response, but also it was a presentation in terms of truth, because in this specific moment, I think that is one of the most critical dangers that we have, just as we both mentioned, and Cristina mentioned this as well. The facts that are being experienced for real, right, that every human being is experiencing and going through, these are not being reported. And as a lawyer, I mean, this is one of those things that is very hard. When I was in charge of the National Center for my team, it was very hard to be in that situation, invest in that position of saying, what do you mean that facts don't matter? But we are living through a time where lack of information, and also the fact that people in power are lying so clearly, but if the lie is repeated once and over and over and over again, and other people repeat that lie, then it becomes a truth. So that is what we're seeing, of these competition of what is the truth, what are the real facts. And in the meantime, these narratives are being formed that are very hard to counter with facts, because just as Cristina mentioned, with all of the data in terms of migration from Africa through Europe, through South America, trying to get to the United States, the reality is it doesn't matter. What a lot of people are actually feeling or experiencing. And there, I think our work, or the work that we are trying to do of creating this vision so that we can have a world where we all can belong, where we all can really have a safe life, right? For us to have the necessary resources. I think for that, we need to be able to talk not just about what are the statistics, the facts, what the science says, and politics, etc., but instead, how should we feel, right? How can we handle or manage those sensations, those feelings, because fear is such a potent feeling, and they are exploiting it. Right? People that are in power, they are seeing how they can use and how they can manipulate all of the sensations that people are having. Actually, yesterday we were walking around the city and I was talking to somebody from Mexico that was telling me how hard it is to also live in Mexico right now. Prices have gone up, there is insecurity, etc., etc. And that is the same sensation that everybody has everywhere in every country. But when politicians are signaling and they're pointing fingers at somebody, they're using these images and they're lying, they are turning those lies into truths. And basically what they're doing is that they are manipulating people's pain, human pain, instead of dealing with the necessary realities that could be changed with social medical insurance or work employment that could pay a fair wage. So I think that the work that we have is to understand, first of all, the narrative and how the media are accomplices in that, but also how can we change the narrative as well so that we can have a more inclusive narrative and people can see a future and imagine a future and feel and say, I want to live in that future. I want my country, my city, my town to be in such and such way, and also to create spaces to be able to tell stories. That is, using maybe indigenous knowledge or the knowledge from people that were here a lot sooner, young people, for youth, for them to be able to have that space to imagine a different world than the one that we are living right now. Y Alina, no sé si tal
Can
vez
you have a
también.
few words and to respond to Christina's comments?
Hola, bueno, también
Hi. Yes. Well, maybe I would just say two things very briefly. One that has to do with, yeah, I mean, I totally agree. Of course, racism is structural. And maybe we have had to live with it for centuries. I mean, this is repeated and is reactivated. And maybe currently we can think that eugenics is an acute version of that structural racism, and eugenics responds to very specific particularities of a regime that is political, social, and economic, that is singular. That is to say, eugenics has not always existed the way that we are identifying it throughout this time. So yes, I think that eugenics can allow for us to understand that brutalization that we are seeing if we are including Membe's words of that brutalization of racism, because at the same time we're talking about these bodies that it's interesting, because even if they don't have or own anything else, they still somehow keep functioning for the neoliberal machinery. So these are bodies that maybe they are displaced and they are sent to prison, but that produces money, and there is a business probably between governments of different countries for that prison to be able to function. So even in these bodies, there's still a way to produce resources. And I think that that is very particular, very specific about all of this. That on the one hand, and on the other hand, I mean, these pictures that Cristina was showing of migration corridors, I mean, these are part of global migration, really. And you can barely really even start to see where migration starts and where it ends, because all of these processes that they're managing are full of these, what I like to call the membership of citizenship. You can be 3/4 of a citizen or 2/3 of a citizen, depending on the regime of citizen or lack thereof, where you are part of. So when she was talking about the borders, it actually even has to do with those processes as well that are very bureaucratic, that are eternal, really, where subjects sometimes are in a limbo, and each time they are also taking more and more from them in terms of citizenship, humanity. I mean, this really becomes a challenge to be able to understand all of that sophistication that has a lot of ways of how it works globally speaking. So those are the two things that I would just share. And I would also like to see what people have to say.
Audience, we've
Gracias.
got about an hour and 5 minutes, so we got an ample amount of time. I'm wondering, Cristina, would you like to respond to anything that either Alina or Marielena shared?
Yeah, I think that I agree with your comments. No, that's, I have interviewed African migrants in Mexico City. That's why I have this information and more. And racism in Mexico is part of the mestizaje, voy a hablar en español, la miscigenación o el mestizaje, que fue la unión de razas, pero cuando se promovió el mestizaje como una raza que no era inferior, porque el objetivo era, no somos inferiores, ¿no? Estábamos, obviamente, la colega que acaba de comentar que hay una renovación de la eugenia con el racismo. Yo digo que hay una continuidad que nunca ha acabado. sigue en la forma de racismo y le cambiamos el nombre, pero es lo mismo, ¿no? Entonces, si ves, por eso entrevisté a los migrantes africanos en México, también los entrevisté en Suecia, también los entrevistamos en Portugal, también los entrevistamos en Brasil. Y el racismo es igual en todo el mundo, porque la eugenesia fue aplicada en todo el mundo, ¿sí? Fue aplicada en todo el mundo. Otra cosa que estuve buscando también para decirles es que la eugenia fue importada, fue exportada como una tecnología de
As
conocimiento
the
para
technology of knowledge to all the countries around the world. We were brought eugenic scientists from other places in the world in order to change the curriculum of the schools. It was what Foundation Rockefeller, Harvard. It was a joint effort to include this in the curriculum as science. So I could have had studied medicine during the years of eugenics. I would have to go to eugenic classes. I will have to say on a test that indigenous people, Afro-American people, are intellectually and morally inferior in order to approve a course or a test. And lawyers, the same thing. All health personnel, all the professors. That's how all the process of independence was taken away of its virtue. In Latin America, a lot of people, indigenous people, African American people, Mexico had 2 years of independence war with massive participation of indigenous people and Afro and Mexican. It was not because of the independence, because it was a reivindication of the children of Spaniards. The reivindication was abolishing slavery because indigenous were slaves. That was why there was the war, and along with the abolition of slavery, independence came about. But they wanted to stop being slaves, and all of this resulted in a revolt and in independence, in an agrarian reform. Agricultural reform, and afterwards a dictatorship came about, and then the Mexican Revolution. Because of the agricultural revolution, again with massive participation of indigenous people. You see the pictures, the women, indigenous people with their guns getting onto the trains to fight. So what was the end of this process? This process ended up after independence was concluded. Then Porfirio Diaz, during the dictatorship, he was a dictator, and then they say, okay, you know what? Stop revolting. You're indigenous. You're inferior. And that was a part of, the fact that you are so aggressive. It proves that you are inferior. And then the revolution, the Mexican Revolution came, the internal conflicts among the revolutionary people. So all of that became part of education. Our children were educated. The children of those revolutionary indigenous people were educated with the idea of eugenics, with scientific proof that Black Americans or Black indigenous people, that indigenous people were inferior. That's what they were taught after all the efforts of so many years. And if that happened for 100 years, and then after the revolution for 100 years, we have to deconstruct all of that, and it's a lot. And it's gonna be tough. And the same thing has to happen with eugenics education. I wanted to say that I agree with you, Cristina, what I mentioned before about continuity, about understanding these topics, that we keep watching them as interconnected: indigenous people, slavery, immigration, the anti-immigration feelings. Yesterday, when we were at the panel, I saw a New York Times article about one of the last changes made by Trump yesterday. and it has to do with erasing history of slavery in the United States. I'm going to read specifically the part of what was said. This was in Philadelphia. I just moved to Philadelphia 6 months ago, so I saw this exhibition on the Independence Square, and the exhibition is called Freedom and Slavery in the Making of a New Nation. That was the name of the exhibition, and it stayed there for years and years. And the current administration issued an executive order that demanded to eliminate this exhibition of slavery, saying that la orden ejecutiva instruye a los servicios del Parque Nacional a que eliminen materiales que se enfocan y que mejor se enfoquen en los ideales de las personas americanas o de las personas estadounidenses y no hablar de la esclavitud. So it's a way of interpreting history from a different lens, erasing the truth, erasing what happened, and imagining what was the United States by erasing. We're not just talking about denying; it's directly eliminating history and the consequences for this for future generations. If children today are not going to these exhibitions, they are not going to learn that history. So the impact of this, which is the same impact that we are living with eugenics centuries afterwards, it is the same thing that is happening not just in the United States, but in many places around the world. So we have to remember that connection at all times.
It's probably about time to open it up for some audience questions. I also want to sort of just check in, are there folks online that are also interested in engaging in the conversation? So I just want to sort of put that out there, and if there are, help me understand how to queue them up, and we'll get them included. And so there are a few hands up presently, so let's get three, give the panelists an opportunity to respond, and then come back and gather another three.
Hola, me llamo Elsa, soy un estudiante en los Estados Unidos. My Spanish is...
Voy a hacer mi pregunta en...
I'm really glad that crime came up in the first presentation on migration, because I think, especially in the United States, it's a common appeal in justifying the militarization of our borders and in anti-immigration sentiments. And I think a common approach from the opposition and from immigration advocates has been to appeal to the innocence of migrants and to affirm that they are not criminals and that they, just like life-affirming qualities. But I'm wondering, especially in the and overlap of anti-eugenics, how much we should rely on these qualities of innocence and victimhood even, especially in migration, and whether it's limiting in that it creates categories of worthiness, of humanness, and if we should be cautious about appealing to innocence in this work.
Great, let's get two more questions.
Pues buenas tardes, yo soy Vicente Diego, soy estudiante del instituto.
I am a student at 17 Institute. I wrote my PhD. I'm also a colleague of Alina in the Department of ITESO in Sociocultural Studies. Definitely, both presentations of today have been tough. Maybe many things that we already knew somehow or at a certain level, but now it has created a whole earthquake within our minds. In the colloquium, a number of concepts have been mentioned, concepts around eugenics, like impossibility of calculate, racialization, imagination. So, of course, this has sparked a lot of food of thought, things that will be important to think for the future, and many questions. One of those questions is, what are we living behind? What are we living outside eugenics? I've been wondering because this term, this kind of umbrella term that hardly finds a space, it's a part of all realms of life. And I was wondering, what's outside eugenics? I was thinking about art. It's something that we have not talked about so far, or maybe it's not part of the conversation. But art could be a place outside eugenics. Also thinking about eugenics as an analytical category. I was also thinking within what Roxana was saying within the micropolitics as spaces of resistance. What what could fracture these structures that present this sad scenario that makes us feel like all sad about the future? And I was thinking about something that Alina and I talked along with Diego Lizarazuiza's proposal that he has, the aesthetics of listening. And it came to my mind because listening is one of the topics that has emerged many times throughout this colloquium. Lizarazu states something interesting. Listening is a way to have access to imagination if it's the way of making possible other futures. In the face of eugenics, listening, and in the face of an apparatus of representation so powerful that apparently seems unable to being broken down, as Diego Lizarazo says in this aesthetics or politics of listening, it's a way of acknowledging the pain of others and reaching some kind of reparation, and maybe reducing the noise and substitute it by a listening with a lot of attention versus this current situation where it's also almost impossible to stop. I think that listening helps us to bring reflection, and I think that listening has a political, ethical, and hermeneutical dimension. Listening, interpreting what's been said. So rather than a question, is just adding something to the conversation. Hello, my name is Rodrigo. Congratulations for this panel that has been quite relevant. My question goes in general for all the participants of the panel. I was wondering, what's the role for scholars in academia in this urgency of breaking narratives, or to break away from this narrative or this eugenic narrative? How can we do a sort of theoretical work that's not linked to the volatility of data? Which is what we continue saying, apparently, is like in this relativity where we are tending towards truths, so to speak. So, what's our role as academics?
Then we'll come back and gather another set of three. Would any of you like to address any of the questions that are on the floor?
Sí, muy buenas preguntas todas. Crime and appealing to the innocence and victimhood. I think just to give you an example of how in my years in the immigrant justice movement, we really tried to tackle that. And one example of that is oftentimes immigrants, again, we internalize the narrative. That's part of the the success of the narrative is when you don't even think about it. It's almost, it's like it's the air that we're breathing. And so for many immigrants, the way that they have internalized that is, I'm not a criminal, so I'm okay. They should go after those bad guys. And look, for people that are living in immigrant communities, if somebody is committing a crime, they are also impacted by it as well. But it doesn't matter if it's by an immigrant, a white US born person, or whoever, like that should be dealt with separately from migration, is my take on that. But the two examples that I'll give in the beginning of last year in January, after Trump was reelected, many undocumented immigrants felt like they were safe. They were like, he's going after the bad hombres, the worst of the worst. He's going after the violent criminals. So we are okay. We're going to focus on working, put our head down, and we're going to be okay. Well, that was never going to be the case. And now people understand that not only are they going after all undocumented immigrants are now criminals, but actually they're taking away legal status away from people that have had legal status. Now having a green card is no longer safe. Now I'm a naturalized citizen, I am no longer safe, right? And so people are starting to recognize the danger with those labels of being, because we are, I think historically, even people within the immigrant justice movement have contributed to some of those narratives. And so the other example that I'll give from a few years ago is I remember being at a press conference that we helped to organize before Congress with young los soñadores, right? Young dreamers, many of whom also had signs, "We're not criminals." And we basically said, we're not going to have a press conference until those signs come down, because we wanted to explain to them that we could not have that message be out there. And it was a learning, so volviendo lo de la escucha, it was a learning opportunity to be like, let's understand and teach each other why those labels end up dividing and creating this, so this group of people are worthy, these are not, these people belong, these people do not. So how are we sometimes unintentionally creating worse narratives that actually continue dividing people? So I think really important question, and to be grappling with that anytime we are coming up with narratives. I think the other question about que se está quedando fuera de la eugenesia, una de las cosas que estaba pensando yo es, and I'm sorry for the interpreters, I keep
One
going
of
back.
One of the things that I was thinking about is that not all topics, for example, about the regulation of immigration, have to do with eugenics. Actually, the fact that many immigrants travel and they migrate because they want a better future for their families, and the way of doing is through their jobs. And for many workers, for many immigrants, job is their identity. My father worked on the textile industry, and working at the facilities, it was a root of pride. He was an expert on fabrics, he was an expert on what he did. So we cannot take that away from people. We need to acknowledge that there are going to be moments where needs are going to be more focused on certain abilities or on certain skills rather than others. But I believe it's important. I mean, the question that you're stating, what's outside eugenics? Because we can make the mistake of thinking that eugenics is such a big umbrella that it kind of loses its meaning because it's so big that it's everywhere. So also keeping that in mind for the rest of the colloquium. And Rodrigo, about the role of academia, because most of us, we are scholars, students, researchers, professors, etc. I think that, and I have repeated this a number of times, what is truth is now being questioned. We need to keep fighting and also leading with truth, with studies. And most important, I would say, focusing on the humans behind those statistics. highlight humanity, highlight the human impact or the planet, the impact on the planet. What's the impact? Speaking about regulatory regulations for migrants, barriers, borders do not only affect the people who are trying to cross a said border. It also impacts the migration of animals, butterflies, for example, and this has an impact on the planet itself. Remembering and bringing upon the connection and making the complexity or bringing more complexity, I would say that for scholars and especially for students who are present, use your imagination, interrupt what we've learning and unlearning so far. We need to keep doing it over and over. We need to use our imagination to think about a future or to concoct a future and a more sustainable future for us and the rest of humanity. I'm gonna try to give a big answer for all of the interventions. I think racism was not an individual decision. It was imposed collectively into all humanity. If we understand it that way, because it was a process that took centuries, we need to re-educate everyone. But not only re-educate in terms of a formal education, it's a whole population. Demystify, deconstruct eugenics in academia and in all levels of society, and creating a critical mass of professionals, students, which is what we are doing here in an event such as this one. It's a political process in the sense that it's collective, it's not individual. This happens in a political context, being financed by big corporations, and authoritarianism, fascism, all of that together is coming back, and it's strengthening these policies and this perspective. So we need to tear this down. How do we do that? Well, we need to change the syllabus. We need to include these kind of discussions as part of education all around the world. To punish racism. In Brazil, we say we have to punish racist attitudes, particularly this time that through social networks, through algorithms, we need to guarantee to get rid of racism. We need to punish any expression of racism. Definitely. Otherwise, people are not going to stop saying things. At least if they don't feel shame for being racist, at least people should be at least afraid or something. If there's an imbalance of power, we need to rethink all the technologies of power and also promote racial identification, because if there is a racial alienation because people learn to deny their race, no, oh, so if I'm inferior, if I'm deemed inferior, but then I'm just going to use some plastic surgery and change the color of my hair and try to become a little whiter. This we internalized all. It's like a Michael Jackson thing, so we need to break down all this alienation and promote identification with our own perspective. That's what we have to bring to academy. Data, it's important. Yes, data is volatile, but there is a way of making longitudinal data and check the trends. Data is volatile, but there are trends, and we can see trends. And this is important to prove that we are not just some inferior, aggressive groups of people that we are imagining aggressions. this is a real thing, and we need to produce data to prove it. It's hard indeed, but we need to do it. We need to measure and prove, because they were saying, oh yes, we're measuring you and we are proving that you are inferior. So now we have to counteract and say, you know what, we're not inferior, we're not aggressive. We are actually receiving the aggression. Alina?
Hi, thank you. Can you hear me? Okay. I wanted to bring a phrase of a Brazilian philosopher that actually was talking precisely about how other apocalypses have taken place. And whenever we go through very dark times, what we need to think is how to be good ancestors. And I really liked that as an ethical principle, to think, how can we be good ancestors? Because probably we, as another colleague says from El Salvador and Paro Marroquin, maybe we are going to have to also do something similar as in the catacombs, because of the risk that maybe we would be going through, or the context that we are seeing. But maybe if we think about being good ancestors, has also something to do with leaving a record, and actually work on that memory for whoever is to come, because maybe it's not going to be in our time. Maybe I'm very pessimistic and probably I should think differently, but thinking about the Mexican context, that it's been in war for 20 years, and probably I am one of those generations that is not going to be able to see something different. Well, then what would I like to be left from a resistance standpoint? So I just like to leave that there. And also about the question for the academia, or regarding the academia, I think that the academia also needs to be doing a self-criticism of its own crisis and not bypass that. That is to say, at what moment did the academia stopped allowing or allowed for the street to be more comfortable? At what moment did we go more to the street? And probably we need to let us be hit by discomfort, but at a very deep level, maybe for that to suppose to change the ways in which we work. Maybe the way in which we organize ourselves or how we gather. And I think that the academia right now, and generally speaking, universities, I think it has a huge role also due to neoliberalization of education. That is to say, where are we focusing education, and how those indicators of education are actually impacting education processes. So I think we need to let ourselves be uncomfortable, and that implies to come up with new ways to work, new languages, new ways to produce, not just to produce knowledge, but also to assess it even. How to be in communication with other sectors of society, and probably also hear something that is going to make us uncomfortable. And talking about the counter narratives that somebody was referring to, there's a text of survival of fireflies from Patolin, and also the review from D.D. Uberman. There is an image that I think is very clear. Spectacularity, generally speaking, or these spectacular narratives and images, tend to be very totalizing. They tend to cover way too much. And there is an image that is relating to that, which is when you have such a bright spotlight, you cannot really see. So these spectacular images that we are submitted to day by day appeal to us somehow. Why? Because they have such a powerful light. And maybe the challenge would be in how to make that light dimmer so that we can look beyond that, so that we can have relations and maybe have constellations with probably smaller lights, and for us to be able to include those with the Deserto text of the immersion of daily life. In the introduction, there is a part that I really like where he says that probably one of the functions of research and the academia is to make those small lights to be part of the network with other discourses, other spaces, other dialogues, for them to be seen more, right? So to facilitate connections to take place. And maybe that could be a work that might be small, but I think that wouldn't make it not important.
Let's get another three.
Yes. Muchas gracias por todo lo que han dicho ahora.
Thank you very much for everything that you have said so far, for your work. Muchísimas gracias por todo el trabajo y todo. Yo soy historiadora, entonces es maravilloso poder escuchar todo lo que están diciendo. Y como académicos creo que tendemos a ser muy pesimistas, o al menos supongo que yo hablo por mí misma, pero muchas gracias, Marielena, en particular, por traer ese optimismo. Entonces me parece que una cosa, digo, no había pensado en esto, pero me encantaría irme de esta conferencia con optimismo. With hope and strength in community. So how can we keep moving ahead with the work, knowing that we are all here for that? Because when there are people that are already in the Supreme Court or in the Department of Justice, we can go to them. No hay forma, al menos no en Estados Unidos, o eso pareciera. Entonces, a lo mejor hay que llevarse ese pesimismo y a lo mejor tener más optimismo. Porque
Energy to continue the work, but yeah, sorry, not a question.
Muy buenas tardes, felicidades por la mesa.
Congratulations for this roundtable. I will introduce myself. My name is Ricardo. I'm also a student here at the Master's Degree Institute. And I would just like to share and probably pose a question. The experience that I had last year with the family of living abroad, living in the United States, in Richmond City, in the state of Virginia, I had the privilege and the honor to meet a family from El Salvador, Mr. Guillermo, his wife, and his daughter. And I had relation to them. We managed to eat together, have meals, talk, and hear their stories about how Mr. Guillermo crossed all over Mexico. Even having COVID, he had to jump over the border, all of the uncertainty, all of the money that he had to pay. And this empathy of hearing these voices, right, just as you were mentioning, is so crucial. So I wonder, what can we do from the academia a little bit as well, from this rebuilding of the academia that Alina was talking about? How can we take these voices for them to be heard? How can we open spaces for these other voices or other narratives can also be heard, especially in this fight of imposing narratives over reality? And for these voices can actually be heard when they come from people that have been subordinated. I don't know if there are spaces. I think this is probably also a matter of the academia, of not speaking for them, but instead to listen to what they have to say. So I think that's important, because just as him, there are millions that, just as Cristina was talking about, they go through the entire continent with this pain, with this uncertainty. Thank you very much.
Perdón, nada más recordar.
My apologies, and I would just like to say Guillermo works from 12 through 14 hours every day in a kitchen, and he only has one free day per week.
Disculpa, Cristina.
Sorry, Cristina. How Brazilian Afro-descendants feel connected, or how do they relate to these African migrants? Do they tend to support them? That would be my question. That is a horror. Racism in Brazil is terrible. It's terrible. Brazil was the last country in Latin America to open a university, for example. It was only open to give a prize to a Belgian person that visited the country in the 20th century, and that has everything to do with slavery. So migrants African migrants suffer a lot of aggressions in Brazil. There have been murders of people from Haiti that they were working on the beach selling products. There have been a lot of assaults and aggressions because this has been interiorized in the population. If we're talking about state policies, they tend to be the ones that support the most, but they of course have to be with the population. So if there is a racist population, they will also suffer that. And especially because if we see that there was an entire process of whiteness as a goal, that also happened in Brazil. So they were referring to it as racial democracy, but that was a lie. So if there is all of this aspiration of being white in Brazil, and they really made all of these efforts to become whiter, then to have black people coming or arriving, they don't accept them. So there is a lot of rejection. And there have been a lot of cases of assault, and that is why they would rather not stay in Brazil and actually keep moving, trying to get to the United States. Here in Mexico, the people that I interviewed, they said that in Mexico City they are more discriminated against versus in the border. So they also want to leave Mexico City. Now, when they go through Brazil, at the airport, etc., yes, they receive supports. Actually, somebody arrived. She realized she was pregnant. They took her to the health center. They had some tests done, but she wants to keep moving and not stay there. What they want to do is to go to the United States, because there is where they can make 5 times more than in Mexico, than in Brazil, and than in their own country. So they want to reach or get to the United States. Some people stay because they don't have any more options. They cannot cross. But those that stay, some were actually in Brazil believing that maybe with this false racial democracy that we made up and we convinced the world, when they arise, they realize how things really are. It's sad, but it's true. So they really suffer a lot of discrimination because they are Black and because they are African. So there is an entire work of the Black movement, and also now with the left-wing government, in terms of recovering the African history that now is included in schools, because I mean we are the second country in the world after Nigeria for Afro descendants. I mean, come on. So we have agreements with African countries. Now we're having some exchanges as well between Africa, Brazil, Africa, supports in terms of technology, education. But this is a slow process too. Right? So we're talking about 500 years, almost 400 years of slavery, 500 of colonialism, and 100 and something of eugenics. That is not something that can be deconstructed so quickly. But there are a lot of efforts from the left-wing governments. And then Bolsonaro came and he destroyed everything. And then he persecuted also universities. Police officers, also prohibits all of these activities of promoting and bringing these voices to the university, just as what you're proposing. I mean, it's hard. It's a never-ending fight. It's daily. It doesn't end, but we need to keep moving forward. Right now, we just signed an agreement, and a group from Brazil will be coming to have these exchanges with Afro descendants, and they do this with a lot of African countries. So movements have conquered a lot of things, Black movements, just as in the United States, but it's not enough, because when we're talking about power relations and everything that went into people's head and all of that brainwashing with eugenics is very hard. That's what I'm saying, that it needs to be more part of the academia. This topic needs to be included in school curriculum, even in elementary schools. Not just as we are doing now in Brazil with the history of Africa and also all of these, but also to demystify all of these myths.
Online?
No, gracias.
No, thank you. Well, Ricardo, thank you so much for sharing Mr. Guillermo's story. Just as you mentioned, he is one of millions, and that is not just in the United States, but all over the world, right? Of these migrant workers that are arriving to a specific place because they're trying to improve their situation with their families and their descendants. And going back to the question that I think Rodrigo had asked previously about the academia and listening, right, that you also mentioned, I think that is what gives me hope, to be very honest, right? The fact that right here in these encounter, in this gathering, so many people have been naming the need to listen, to create spaces so that we can hear more. It's the only way. The work that I have been doing of advocacy and law, specifically, were in the last few years. When I have seen changes, for example, when there is a Republican or representative, usually is when they know it's not enough just to listen the story, but also for them, just as what you did, you met Mr. Guillermo personally, right? So whenever somebody can actually see somebody else, another human being, and listen their story from them directly to better understand the complexity of how their experience was like, then both people end up being transformed. And it is important for a dialogue to take place, right? That it is not just one person telling the story, but both of them are listening to each other. They can hear each other, they can communicate, they can learn from each other, and that is what is going to happen. That transformation for each human being is what little by little changes the world. Obviously, this is work that takes very long time, so that is where the academia, or maybe some other organizations, NGOs, I don't know, a lot of entities can create these spaces for those encounters where people can be heard, and they can create even trainings in terms of how you can be in a conversation and you can have a difficult conversation with somebody else where both people or maybe the entire group are afraid of talking about very controversial, delicate topics that they're afraid of speaking about. But if we don't create that space for people to speak up, communicate, hear from each other, we're not going to progress. So I think that that is where the academia and the institutions that are actually here present can create those spaces, those trainings. But after that, the intention is also to report and write about what came out of those encounters or those gatherings. What can we learn from that? And the other thing is, going back to the statistics, the reports, the research, is not to just leave those stories of Mr. Guillermo, for example, just as individual stories, but instead to highlight that these stories are a representation of the structural, of the systemic, because that is where the problem comes from. Many times in my experience, for example, if I have a meeting with a senator, maybe they hear to Mr. Guillermo's story and he thinks, well, yes, he is a good person, but the other migrants are not. And so that's where they go back to that. And also the previous question in terms of being aware that with these stories, we don't end up believing or creating this idea that these are isolated stories, that these are the good migrants, but not the rest. But instead, the intention is to connect, to once again make sure that we are connecting and connecting and creating a space for learning and for transformation. ¿Tenemos más preguntas por parte del público o en línea? Nada más quisiera revisar para ver si hay alguien más que tal vez está esperando en línea para poder.
Hola, trataré de ser breve.
Hi, I'm going to try to be brave. I think that we all are really trying to make an effort to find some possibility of action. And art was also mentioned at some point. But art how? Or from what perspective? Because I think that one of the important things that could be counterweight, for example, is that Badiou says that there are 4 possibilities of truth. One of them is art. Like beginning there, that would be the first thing. Now with this crisis of truth, well, okay, that is one possibility. But how is that art? And I am being invited to be part of a program, a peace program, they are calling it in Michoacan, where culture and art are being involved. And so we are now considering that. So if all of this spectacularity as an Aristotle element of the dramatic construction that is now mixed up with truth, but for very long it has been an element of the North American culture, that spectacularity, it is so much so that we don't actually see this as one more of the elements, such as the argument or the ending. The spectacle was one more element. Anyway, but it now is contained. So if that is so, then it means that these forces or these powers are appealing to the imaginary. So finally, that means that that is the art's terrain. So if they are appealing to the imaginary, then, and I hear you, and I really thank you for these exchanges. And actually, there was some type of intuition that probably was telling me maybe we in Michoacan would need to go back to orality. So, for example, that is a purépecha type of art, and I don't really know how, but the intention is to appeal to that lost imaginary that could counter as a truth act the crisis that we're having. Specifically, that is with actions that can come from the academia that we sometimes feel that we are imprisoned by. But at the end, it does generate critic and thought. So how can we translate that into action? And well, again, as I said, art is one of those elements in that sense. Thank you. ¿Alguien más? Sí, parece que hay otra persona allá atrás. Y tal vez ya después vamos a...
Muchas gracias. Ha sido un...
Thank you very much. This has been a very, very interesting panel. It has made me think. I mean, if we were talking about these narratives, we as human beings, we are understanding ourselves by narratives. We explain our story through narratives. And so these media narratives have made such an impact on people due to the exposure that they have, right? So I think that many times the academia's role is very limited because we are not participating in that massive exposure. Many times we are not even really interested in it. The science, the spread of science, for example, which is very important in Mexico. In some other countries, it's not. The academia lives for itself. And so I think we should make that connection for these discussions that we're generating in the academia to be massive. Right now, we have a millionaire that owes taxes and he doesn't want to pay, but he owns media and he is now distributing his own narrative that now has that same line of saying it's actually very fascist, but that's it, you know. So I do think that in order for us to be able to have real power of change, we would also need to try to have that reach. We would probably need to also think and elaborate products that are not just understood by intellectuals or people that are members of the academia, but instead that these are products that can actually be appealing, that people would want to see, that the people that are consuming some of these programs and this content, these people that are paying attention to the media, for them to also be interested as well, for them to also be interested in these same languages. So in that sense, I guess that this is a media battle that we also would need to show up for. I don't know what you think about it. Tal vez podemos tener algunas respuestas.
And then maybe I'll finish with a few concluding thoughts. Alina, would you like to go first?
Bueno, pues es que creo que esta pregunta sobre...
I think that this question about what the academia needs to do, I mean, probably that would be the 1 billion question. I don't think that anybody right now has the answer, to be honest. And I think we also need to be honest in that regard. Probably instead, we need to start to rehearse participation, advocacy, knowing that we can make mistakes, but not stop doing it. I think we need to run the risk of making mistakes as well. Probably that would be one of the things that I would say in that sense. And now, in terms of the art, yes, undoubtedly, I do think that aesthetics as a practice is a very fertile place to promote or to rehearse or to exercise, to make or have a possibility of new imagination modes. Once again, not really knowing what is going to come out of it, but trust processes a little bit more on the outcomes. That's what I would say. And of course, when we think about art, I always think about it from the work with what is sensitive, not necessarily from the Beaux Arts or the contemporary art, but instead the creative practice, the symbolic production in very clear spaces that can allow to generate new things. I mean, I do think that we need to run the risk to generate more experimental scenarios. That would be my answer. I would leave it there.
Estos últimos dos.
These last two questions or comments for me, I think, are very similar and very important. I'm so happy that you mentioned art, because throughout the entire colloquium, I believe that this is one of the things that we need to include a lot more. And I see Lucia over there, that she is actually one of the artists that we have here, and there is a panel specifically about that. But I think that art is one of the ways to disseminate information and new narratives. In terms of the question that you just asked, Alberto, in the academia, we cannot just stay there. If we're only talking to ourselves, reading our own articles in research, etc., we're only listening to our same voices, and then we're not going to change anything, to be very realistic, right? So we need to find the way to reach the masses, the people, to be able to present different ideas. And I think that art, in all its forms, from music to poetry, the murals that we have here, history, novels, movies, right? All of that is going to create that culture, and we need to do more. I think that tomorrow, that we're going to be having the last day of the colloquium, when we talk about future and the strategies to follow after this encounter, I think it's going to be very important for us to think about those, well, three things. I think it has to do with listening, also art, and how we can make our thought, our vision, our critique of a new future, to how it can reach much more people, millions or billions of people, so that we can really change the narrative and we can create a fair world for future generations. Just to finish, I wanted to read something from the Miro's question about hope. It made me remember a leader from Hawaii. She is Hawaiian. Her name is Norma Wong, and she wrote a book that was published beautifully during the elections day last week in the United States. And Cuando nada funciona, esta es una perspectiva sobre resiliencia, propósito compartido y liderazgo en el lugar y el momento del colapso. And what she says is, en momentos de crisis,
Crises are the critical juncture when and where change begins. There can be no leaps forward without risks and the presence of the unknown. Without that initial leap, our imagination can be limited to the boundaries of our current possibilities. This facing squarely and leaning into becoming without an interval of hesitation, this is the becoming part of beingness, of pertenecer. So I just wanted to leave you with that. This moment of crisis that we're experiencing, so many crises, this is where that critical juncture of opening, where we will be able to create the world that we all envision and that our future generations deserve. So, gracias.
Thank you. And let me share just a few closing thoughts, trying to pull together some of the themes. I think going back to the sort of early part of the panel, really thinking about race, the idea of race is serving two purposes. One, it is referential to the body, to the physical body of the nation. So when I think about borders as protecting the racial integrity of the nation. But race is also the mechanism through which the humanization is transmitted. And in order to wrap my head around it, I had to do a little bit of a semantical revision and moving away from conversations about race to talking about racialization, which gives it more of an active quality. And speaking to people about racialization and identification, we can then talk about it as a process and apply historical tools of analysis, changing continuity over time, different perspectives. And so just thinking about some intellectual tweaks that may make some of these ideas a little bit more accessible to folks who don't study them on a regular basis, because that's also part of who we have to consider our audience as being, as people beyond this room. And I think part of the danger and the appeal of eugenics is the simplistic worldview that it offers. And so then how do we think about our work as creating scaffolds that allow us to inhabit complexity over time? And so in some ways it requires us moving away from thinking about actions or products, but to events, to processes that are not time bound, because the reality is these things have taken a long time to get deeply inculcated, and it will take a long time to unroot them, or at least create some more critical possibilities. And so does that give us a little bit of latitude to think more creatively about how we might sort of think about intervention as a long-term process that is not time-bound? And I think that's important to consider. Let's see. I thought that language of spectacle to violence was actually really, really useful, particularly thinking we've got a reality TV president, right? I think oftentimes we dismiss the fact that 12 years of socialization, normalization, that kind of interaction took place, and that's given our president a very deep sort of capture of the audience. But I do think this idea, is there a way in which we could use the same sort of cinematic, or at least that language, to think about narratives of abundance, narratives of possibility? Because I think too often these narratives are narratives of a reduction in pathology, and I think we can maybe flip the script on that. I'm not sure how, but I think it's just it may be worth considering. I think there was a question earlier, like, there's a danger sometimes in inhabiting the pathologies that are applied to us, and I think about how the trauma narrative has been taken up and become the very mechanism of pathology, when in fact it was sort of usurped from a useful clinical tool to then using it as a way to sort of redefine or re-racialize people as deficient and somehow defective. And then as a response, seeing communities present themselves as pathologized in order to get the resources that are being withheld in the first place. And so how do we hold that tension, and how do we sort of talk about that? And I think I'll conclude with sort of sharing some tools. So Stacy Kurtzman, who's here, she's a colleague I work with at home. A few years back, we were trying to, in the midst of all the foment, we were trying to sort of articulate the tools or dispositions or skill sets that have allowed people to move from sort of the allure of essentialism into something that allows them to inhabit complexity a little bit more. And I think the tools that we kind of developed together were, first, is committing to rewire. And for me, rewiring is a cognitive process. It's creating an intellectual scaffold that's rich enough or has enough nodal points to hold the complexities of the conversations that we're trying to have. You know, it sounds esoteric, but I think, like, if you don't have a scaffold that's rich enough, you can't hold the complexity of the ideas, and then the simplicity becomes more attractive. And I just think that that's important to consider. Sitting with dissonance, that's highly consistent with the theme that's come up, which is around listening. And I think sitting in dissonance and reclaiming the capacity to sit in dissonance is actually really important, as these technological tools allow us to offload not only some of our cognitive work, but also some of our affective work, right? We retreat into these places that are safer, but it comes at the expense of developing the capacities are maintaining the capacity to do the very work that we need, which requires that we're able to hold dissonance. Part of that holding dissonance is learning how to honor and access different narratives. We're having and living through different experiences of racialization. And while it may not sort of resonate with us directly, it doesn't mean that it's not happening to somebody else. And so how do we create the conditions in which we can be open to each other's narratives, right? And part of that to me is understanding positionality. How do our different experiences of racialization not just connect us, but in some cases make us invisible to each other? And so how do we do with that? And I guess the last piece that we found to be very effective is moving beyond essentialism. So how do we use the data, the stories, the narratives to counteract these imposed narratives of deficiency, these imposed narratives of criminality, when we know, or this post-factual world, when we know that there are assets and ways of telling these stories that would give people a more nutritious story, something more actionable and more beneficial and certainly more communitarian. So there's a lot on the table, but as we move towards the conclusion of the colloquium and we begin to think about our strategy sessions, I think it's important to sort of hold these tensions with us, really sort of forefront the listening and the being willing to sit in distance with each other. And I think it's through this kind of foment that we begin to see some possibilities emerging. And so I just want to extend a thank you to the panelists, and thank you for jumping in particular, Cristina. And I also want to give a big shout out to the interpreters and the signers who were here yesterday. I didn't see the signers today, but the interpreters doing amazing work back there. So, and lastly, give yourselves a hand. I'm sure it's time for a bio break. People can use some sun, some food,
And
you know,
I've been
all of
asked
that.
to
So
remind you to return your
listening devices.
yes, los audífonos, la interpretación.
So thank you.
No se los olvide regresarlos, por favor.